Hey there everyone, welcome back to part 2 of the free Blender for Beginners 3D modeling course that I'm doing on YouTube. Really exciting stuff. So in the last video we covered pretty much the entirety of the interface and object mode and a little bit of transforming and some of its key relationships with object mode and edit mode. And I thought about this long and hard and I wanted to dive right into the EXP S3 Holographic Sight for, a cool hard surface 3D game modeling asset. However, at the end of the day, I don't think we're going to get very far if you don't know how to use edit mode. So I figured we're just going to have to go over a couple of basics and then we'll put in our reference images of that holographic sight and we'll be able to make a lot more progress from there. But I want to show you the modeling tools and principles that I'm looking at the most and that I'm using the most. We'll make a super basic shape, but this should get you comfortable clicking the same keyboard shortcuts that I use in Blender, so hopefully that's the way this works out. So we'll start with just this basic cube, and we don't have a specific goal, but like I showed you, we're going to press Control here, and I'm going to move it up 1 meter, just like how I showed you a little bit about the snapping and the increments. And though we might not use it for this exercise, this third button is proportional editing. In hard surface models, you're not going to need this as often, but for organic stuff in large scale variation, it's super important. So let's turn it off first and see what it does if we just grab an edge. I just selected edge mode right here. I can press grab and we can just move it anywhere. I can go to vertice mode and move stuff around. So once I click on proportional editing, which I can also activate and deactivate with O, I'll use O to turn it on. And I also have to make sure that our pivot point is back at its default, which is typically medium point, because we're looking for the medium point of our selection. So now if I press G to grab, it's not only moving those, but if I just select one of them, it'll start moving the entirety of the selection based on a soft radius, and you can change the size of that radius with the scroll wheel. So that'll be really useful for more organic stuff and, abstract large environments, all sorts of lattice deformers. It gets really advanced, but for a lot of rigid stuff and hard surface mechanical type things, it's not used as often, but it's great to know about it. Let's show off one of the first hotkeys for edit mode. If I select everything with A, I can press Shift D to duplicate. And I just duplicated it in edit mode. And don't be concerned, because you can also take your final object back in object mode and Shift D to duplicate that as well. So it's a really good example of how you can have multiple meshes in one object. I feel like over explaining that would actually make it worse. So yeah, you can have multiple meshes in one object, but then you can duplicate that object. So, do whatever you want with this. Now let's do another example. Really quick. Instead of Shift D to duplicate, what I'm going to do is press Alt D. And though we might not use this in the final iteration of our model, what Alt D does instead of Shift D is if I go back to the original model and make a change, perhaps with proportional editing now, this second object and its third object and its fourth and its fifth will always inherit what's happening to that first one. So say you're working on a tree or something and you have 1,000 trees, now you're able to just change one element of it with, your editing tools, and all the trees will adapt to it. And it's a lot easier on your computer too. Very cool. Let's get another cube. I just press Shift A and I'm always getting our little default cube buddy back. I always go into edit mode, G, Control, and lift it back up on the ground. So we've already explored grab, and don't forget we can lock axis. And so the first thing I can do to this to start adding information to our cube is with a really popular shortcut called Control R. I really recommend that you Control R all over your model and get really used to just spamming that everywhere. But before I left click to apply it, I can actually use my scroll wheel to change the amount of cuts that I can add through this entire loop of edges. It followed the 4 quads that went around this cube, and that is considered an edge loop. Similarly, if I press Ctrl Z and then use Ctrl R to add a loop cut again, now it's following the edge loop of this top side. So this would be a loop, that would be a loop, and it doesn't always have to be just one direction. Now it can face the other loop, or it could face this way and face this edge loop, And so this is the best way to add more resolution or add more information to a 3D model. So I know it's looking a little scary, and I think even if you press shift, going through each one of these just to make a simple edge selection is going to be really intimidating. So let's learn about selection. This is why I wanted to make this video before we go hard in the paint, because we will go very hard. So if we want to select this edge loop, typically you could use shift, but in order to make a selection faster, let's say I want to directly select these two edges between this one. I have my first one selected. I'll just hold Control and click on this one, and now it just selected everything between those. So if this model were 1,000 edges long in this direction, and I'm using Control R on my scroll wheel to just add a bunch, I no longer have to just go one by one and try to get all these edges. It would be really, really difficult. I could just hold Control and I've selected all those edges in between there. Furthermore, for every edge that isn't broken, notice how these perpendicular edges are now breaking this edge. If it's not broken, we could just press Alt and it selects the entire edge loop. Notice how this is not being broken from a perpendicular like face. So if I hold Alt on this one, it's going to select the entire edge around it. So it's a total double-edged sword. But now with this selected, I can press something like S and Y, and we can widen that. So we're getting really clean transformations just because we understand that we can move things at certain angles, we can scale things at certain angles, and maybe let's check out the side view over here, and it's a good time to maybe use both proportional editing and X-ray mode. I can grab these top edges and rotate it like only on the Y-axis. We can scroll it down. So if I turn off X-ray mode, we'll notice that the proportional editing is making it move with it, very nice and smooth. And then with our edge selection tools like Alt, we can easily grab a whole edge loop. If I want to get everything between this one and this last one, I'm holding Control, and it just grabbed all those, but not the whole edge loop, unless I pressed Alt click. Now that whole edge loop is selected. And so I can press Shift and Alt and start adding more edge loops to my selection and go crazy. What about S and X over here with proportional editing off? And yeah, things start getting really interesting. As long as you have a decent understanding of how to select your edges, then all will be well. And I believe it's Control Alt to get what's called an edge ring, and it's basically an edge loop, right? But with Control Alt, it's getting the actual opposite direction of all of those. So I don't use that as often, but it's still really, really handy. Most of the time, I'm just pressing Alt to select an edge loop, and then again, it's Control Alt for those edge rings. There are more selection options. If I select a bunch of these, for instance, there are some more procedural selection tools. For example, if something were to have just be a triangle or be an n-gon, which is a face with more than 4 sides, notice that these are all rectangles, which are quads. I don't want to obsess over that, but we will pretty soon. So yeah, there's a lot of different ways to select different things. The one I'm looking for is actually checker deselect, and this is really useful for a bunch of different patterns. If we had a flat plane, polygon plane per se, and we selected everything and then did checker deselect, maybe we can make every single one of these move that direction. You know, poor example, but again, there's not many procedural selection tools, but one of them is checker deselect. Most of the time, it's Alt or Control Alt or just Control, and then I'm adding Shift to that. So, you know, I can start adding a lot to my selections, and becoming a master at selection is becoming a master at 3D modeling. Notice we're not checking out any of these menus, we're not digging through these tools, but now it is time to check out some more editing mode tools. So after a quick look through our toolbar, most of the time we're going to be using keyboard shortcut variations of these, but I think for the sake of this demonstration video, it's going to be within our best interest to do a little demo of these if you haven't before. If you're more advanced, I can recommend you skip to the third video where we actually get into just going ham on creating the holographic sight. But if you're a beginner, let's go through this together and it's totally okay. Extrude region, we're not going to overcomplicate this situation. This tool simply adds more faces depending on which way we pull it. So I never actually select this, and it should be telling us the keyboard shortcut if it had good manners, but it's not. I'm always having box selected, and you'll see me I'll keep going back to that. And for extrude, it's E. Just like the EA Sports guy. So this E tool is the fastest, best way to add usable information with your model. See, I'm pressing E and then X, bringing it in a different direction. I can grab all these, remember Control with the faces, and E and X to bring those out. And no, this model is not anything specific, but we're learning how to master those types of controls. So we'll check out this next one, and this is Inset. Again, I'm not going to select this for now. What I'd like to do is tell you the keyboard shortcut. And for Inset, it's I. Well, what the heck does Inset do? Inset is a little funkier in which it's similar to extrude, but brings it inwards instead. You could always lift it up and then it counts as an extrusion. Watch this. Let's press I. That's an inset. So I could lift it up and you'll see it's just like an extrusion. But if I press Ctrl Z and extrude again from here, we've basically created a border around our selection, and we've created a lot of interesting, more inward geometry like that. So you kind of have to be careful though, because let me show you the most common 3D modeler mistake. And the mistake is extruding inwards without knowing what to do after. So I've extruded in here, and then I'm going to extrude in here too. So we've gone a little bit too crazy, and notice that I'm now no longer respecting the form of the 3D geometry. You'll see that the inside is now going outside of the model. And that's just something I want you to be aware of. You'll start seeing funky things if you're not careful. But being careful doesn't mean you should be scared, right? We're going to be able to hopefully get through this model together. And I want to make sure that that one button doesn't end up ruining your whole night. So we'll watch out together for situations where extruding the wrong way could just be unpleasant. And so that was a conversation worth having with you right there. So bevel is a really awesome one in which we can round out our edges and corners. So now I'm going to press Ctrl B. And there's a couple tools that we can activate once this is on. I like how these edges are now chamfered. Notice that we have a little menu down here. There's a lot of controls, and I really wouldn't worry about too many of them. When we moved our mouse, it's the same as this width one, and the ones I'm just looking at are segments and profile shape. I don't look at anything else. So for segments, I'm going to increase it to 2 or 3 or 4. However, for most 3D modeling purposes, you only need either 1 or 2. And so I want to show you something really interesting here. The profile shape is what literally changes the shape of that bevel. And if this were just a low poly model, we might think this rounded shape is like perfect. But the fact of the matter is we're going to get into what's called subdivision modeling. And it's the version in which we're modeling basically the exact same thing, but we're going to smooth it out at the end so that it looks just really high fidelity. And the caveat of that is that when you smooth it out, it really smooths it out. So the best way to handle that is when we add our edges, we're going to add these bevels that kind of capture our corners. And I'll show you what that looks like right now. So notice I just clicked the wrench and I'm adding a modifier, and I'm going to type in subdivision surface. Like I said, we'll do subdivision surface modeling. It made it pretty freaking wonky right now, but it's doing exactly what I want it to. It just smoothed out everything exactly the way I told it to. With Control R, if I added another edge loop now, say right here, it's now tightening it because it's getting the average between those two edges. So now I can bring it in. I'm tightening that model. I can get another one and make it tighter near the top, and I can start adding control loops or edge loops, whichever one works for you. And we can start really defining the shape of these smoothed out models with very little effort. We're getting a lot of decent control from this subdivision surface and just some edge loops. Okay, so I just looked through these and we're going to go through 4 more tools really quickly. The next one we're going to go through is knife, and that is the K tool. And this is going to be used for pretty much like a ton of things that can't be dealt with simple scaling or simple edge loops. Like let's say I need a specific triangle shape in here. I just pressed K and clicked on a vertex, and now I'll click again. And now I'm building a sort of custom shape within my 3D model. I just made some really random shape, and I can even click back between points and use it sort of like a line tool in Photoshop. So I just made the ugliest shape, but I could take our new triangle shape and extrude it outwards. And that's something I wouldn't have been able to do so easily if I didn't have the knife tool, unless I was being, actually professional, and we could always inset that as well and then extrude it. So, knife, we can give this a freaking smiley face and no one would be none the wiser. So really cool stuff that you could do with the knife tool. We're not going to get into the spin too much. In architecture, it's extremely important, but if I select all these and then go to the tool panel up here, which is not always used, but for some of these more peculiar tools, this will pop up. We're going to change its axis and look for the right one, and then I'll press Shift right click, and the spin tool moves with the 3D cursor. So I'm trying to see what would be a nice arc for this piece, and I wish it would go to the other side, but I noticed, yeah, that circle would look pretty good with it. So I'm just using the spin tool now to drag it across, and we've created an entire arc on this 3D model. This guy's definitely developing a personality, but he's got a heart of gold for sure. So edge slide is going to be really useful once you start getting to the nitty gritty of your actual edge modeling. Let's say I added an edge right here and in all these random spots. Well, the edge slide will help me move it across without disrupting the geometry. So if I just used grab, maybe I tried to move it here and then I checked the other angle, I'm like, oh, it's so busted and I wish I could go back. Well, if I was smart enough to go back and then I did an edge slide instead with double G, then it would behave a lot nicer and I could move it around without breaking anything. So that's going to be super useful. See, I'm going to even this space out with that double G technique, and that is the edge slide. Really handy. And so very quickly, we don't need to do it to anything specific, but the keyboard shortcut for this one is Alt S, and to shrink and fatten things, it is really useful because what it's doing is it's scaling just like the regular scale. If I press Alt S, now it's scaling along the normals. And to quickly explain that, a normal is the direction at which something faces. So look at all these faces right here. In mesh edit mode, there's a couple extra buttons up here now. And in the normal section, we could look at the face normals. So we could see the direction that they're going. We could look at the vertex normals. And these are really important when it comes to shading, but it's a little more advanced. So maybe we'll discuss it a bit later. Notice how these are all flat polygons, and that's why these vertex normals are pointing out in very random directions like that. And then we have the same one for edges. So just understanding the direction at which a polygon faces is really important. Why is it really important? I will show you right now. And it's good we're getting into this before we start debugging an entire hard surface model. Let's say, and maybe close your eyes if we need to, because I'm using a special menu called Alt N, which brings up the normals menu, which we won't mess with a lot, but I just flip these normals. It's really easy to get flipped normals when you're adding geometry and you're deleting stuff and going crazy. So these normals are now flipped. If I go to the overlays panel and then click on face orientation, we'll notice that they're red now. And Blender specifically doesn't treat it too harshly for low poly modeling. However, once you get past that step, you are going to want to make sure that your normals aren't red, because it won't smooth correctly, it won't UV map correctly, it won't render correctly, it won't join geometry together correctly. It will really punish you for having these red normals. And so most of the time during the modeling process, I will go to the overlays and I'll click on face orientation. So to heal this, I can select all these, and instead I'll press Control, and I'll press Alt-N to bring up that normals panel again, and I'll just flip these ones. Or if a bunch of random ones are really busted and you don't know what to do, I would just select everything and press Alt-N and do recalculate outside. So we are absolutely killing it, and it's time to just show you one more tool in edit mode, and that is the shear. The shear tool is really interesting. I would use it a lot for, say, building the corner of a wall. You know how walls can join together at a 45-degree angle? Well, if you were, let's actually add a cube, for example. What you could do if you were creating a wall is, if we were in X-ray mode, we could rotate this and then try to scale it and then extrude it 90 degrees and try to make our wall from there. But what I think would be a better option is to actually use the shear tool, and it protects the geometry as it rotates it. So now with these two sides perfectly parallel, I can press E and X and we can continue this on in all sorts of awesome ways. So now I can use this side of the shear and extrude this down. And like we've shown with scaling, I can press SZ and 0 and flatten that out, maybe G and Z to bring it down. Super basic modeling principle, but with just basic movement in the shear tool, we're getting a lot out of that. And so there's not a lot of complex modifiers that we're going to be using within this course, but the final boss of understanding 3D modeling within edit mode, at least for now, is two things actually. One is this transform, the individual origins. We have median point, which will let us scale the middle of that selection. We do have 3D cursor, where if I press Shift C to bring that cursor back to actually the world origin, and maybe I should have discussed that in the last video, but that is now scaling with the pivot point of the 3D cursor. And that last one, which I always find really important, actually two more, is not only individual origins, which means both of these will scale exactly on their own, but also active element. So the active element is whatever glows white, or whatever your temporary cursor is around, like your tool. So let's say this was the active element. Now it'll all scale exactly from this point. Now why is that so useful? It's because let's say I needed this to exactly scale from the floor. Now that this piece is my active element, I can scale and it'll always stick right there. And I need both of these smaller individual origins, and I can go to median point and make the whole thing bigger, and I can go to 3D cursor and scale it in from there. Changing these transform modes just gets really handy and super important. Really quick, even though it's self-explanatory, vertex snapping, I know I have the magnet icon on. I'll turn it off and use Control to move it and then snap it. Really, really cool. So I could start absolutely destroying this with some premium vertex snapping. And the same goes for edge. If we have edge mode on, as well as face. We're getting messy in here, but totally okay. It's now snapping to all these different faces. And as you build your 3D model, you'll notice that even though we snapped these vertices together, they're not actually joined together. And that can be really scary because you're not going to notice that these 3D points are disrupted or overlapping or actually destroying the smoothing process. You don't want vertices that are joined together but not actually merged. And so the way to fix that is with the M key. Let's select all these ones and I'll press M and merge. Now it's completely merged and it's not going to give me problems like that. Let's see if this one has a merged one. The rest seem to be okay, but if I wanted these ones to be merged, I can merge them at the center And if I just use control with the vertex snapping on, and I brought these all together, I have two options. I could either go to options up here and click auto merge, which is completely fine. Or if I didn't want to do that, when I'm done joining vertices together, I can press A, M, and then join by distance. And now it's just making sure that all the vertices that are overlapping are being joined. But just in case I didn't want to auto merge everything I was touching, yeah, I can leave that off. So we're getting really far. I'm going to delete this piece. And the way I'll delete the whole piece is by pressing L. L allows me to select an entire mesh. Really cool. I can press Shift L to unselect, but I'll press L, X, and delete. I'll use Alt in my middle mouse to snap to the middle. Now let's use a little bit more advanced approach of the knife brush. I'll press K, and notice we have some a little bit of options down here. It's not entirely intuitive, but I pressed K for knife, A for angle, and C for cut through. So now when I use the knife, it's locked to an angle and it's cutting through the entire mesh. So if I press enter on that, I can select everything else and press X and delete it. Now, why would I do that? It's because if I move it back to the world origin, we can add a new modifier called the mirror modifier. Let's zoom out and see what the heck it did. So if I go to 1, which is the front view, this is a good example of how we observe rotation and scaling and transforms. So let's not get too confused here. When I press 1, I want that to be my front view. So if I select my object and then go to edit mode, I can select everything and rotate it on the Z axis by 90 degrees. And it did it by the 3D cursor, so it brought it really close to the center. Now with this mirror modifier on, if I click clipping, I can bring it together and these vertices will nicely conjoin together. So one thing I want to make sure is that the transforms are zeroed out, because when the transform is at the center of the world and everything is at the correct numeric value, the mirror modifier works at its best. So there's two ways to bring this piece back to the center without disrupting the actual origin. One way is to go into edit mode, select everything and bring it in, and now that's its new beautiful origin point. Or you could just move in object mode and then press Ctrl A and apply its location, or everything. If you move it along and apply it there, its origin point just goes back to the center. So we're gonna have to bring this to the center and apply it again. So no matter where you go, that origin point keeps moving back, and then the mirror modifier moves. So try to keep everything at the world origin and your life will be way better. So really impressive. There are a few more tools that don't have a shortcut, like poke faces, which, you know, try to get the center of the face and then add some more in there. So you're almost a modeling master. There's like just one or two keyboard shortcuts I'm going to show you super quick. So with control, I've grabbed all these and I'll use one that's actually only available to click over here, which is rip. And that'll help me bring it up. I just use V to rip those off. Pretty freaking exciting. So now, even though it's a little messed up, like I can delete this edge and only delete specific components. Now in vertex mode, what we're going to do is we're going to select an imaginary rectangle of 4. That is how you build something with vertices in Blender. So if I press F from that add-on, it made a face. It doesn't have to be a rectangle. It could be a triangle as well. Just try not to go crazy and add a bunch of vertices to one F, because then it won't really make a lot of sense. You have to try to respect what the quads and triangles are doing, and that takes some time if you're brand new. But as you could see that these rectangles are forming that shape. The way these rectangles are forming that shape. See, this one has more than 4 sides, and it's not entirely a big deal because it's completely flat, but a smart 3D modeler would take his knife tool and maybe cut across, and now we have 2 rectangles that are building that form. But instead of saying rectangles, these are quads. Tell your smart friends that you learned all about quads and tris. So I'll grab these vertices and use F to fill those up as well. And I'm filling out those spaces. So I used V to rip these vertices up, and then I used F to fill out the space. So if you go over this video, we may as well have at least used one of everything, which is really awesome. If I haven't used something, it's probably because I don't use it that much. So we went over selection, and we went over some of the most used modifiers I used. We'll go over more. We went over all the most craziest edit mode tools, and genuinely, I'm just really proud of you. Hopefully in the future, when I make a super advanced tutorial, you guys will all be ready for it because you watched this video. So part 3 will be the ELO sight. But yeah, this part 2 was all about you mastering Blender, so really good job. I'll see you in the next video, and thank you.